of the Devils, about how Hitler and Stalin met and made this alliance. Munich, by the way, is never described as the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact or the Nazi-British Pact, which it was. It's always antiseptically called Munich. Well, as I said, the Soviet Union had made repeated overtures to conclude collective security pacts with the United States and Great Britain in order to contain both German and Japanese aggression. These overtures were repeatedly ignored or rebuffed, including the Soviet attempts to render armed assistance to Czechoslovakia. In time, Soviet leaders lost what little confidence they had had in the sincerity and ultimate purposes of the Western democracies. It was evident that had Hitler at this time struck directly at Russia, he would have encountered very little, if any, opposition from France or Britain. As the historian Foster Dulles notes, the American government and Great Britain and France had an attitude which was to do nothing to free the Soviet Union from its anxieties regarding Hitler's crusade against communism. If it were impossible to crush Nazi aggression by a united front, Stalin felt the next best thing for Russia was to attempt to divert any immediate German attack from the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1939, the Soviets made frantic efforts to enter into negotiations with Western leaders, French and British leaders. French and British sent a delegation by boat to Moscow, which took a week. When they arrived, they had no protocol papers. And the question came up is, where are your papers? Who do you represent? Can you negotiate with state authority? It became clear during that summer that a stall was underway. So what in fact happened is that Stalin began to make overtures with the Nazis. Isolated by the West, frustrated in its last-minute attempts to form an anti-Nazi alliance with Great Britain and France, and I would point out the Soviet Union was the only country in 1936, 7, and 8 that was the only major country that was trying to form an anti-Nazi alliance. And believing that it was being set up as a target for Hitler's aggression, and they believed correctly, the Soviets decided to sign an 11th-hour non-aggression treaty with Hitler in the summer of 1939. To this day, the conservatives talk about this diabolic affinity between the Nazis and the communists for signing this pact. Conservative news columnist George Will would write, "The 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact truly was a joining of kindred spirits." On another occasion, George Will described the Soviet Union as a regime that was, quote, once allied with Hitler. In fact, the Soviet Union was never allied with Nazi Germany. The pact was a treaty, but it wasn't an alliance. It no more indicated an alliance with Nazism than would a non-aggression treaty between the United States and the Soviets indicate a U.S. alliance with communism. The pact was neither an alliance nor an agreement for the partition of Poland. Now, Munich had been a true alliance for partition. The British and the French dictated partition to the Czechs. They said, you obey, this is what's going to happen, and you better toe the line, and the Germans are taking you over. The Soviet government undertook no such action against the Poles. They merely promised to remain neutral, which is what the Poles had always asked them to do anyway. The Poles did not want to enter an alliance with the Soviets against the Germans. More than this, the agreement was, in the last resort, anti-German because it limited the German advance eastward in case of war. This is what Winston Churchill emphasized. With the pact, the Soviets hoped to ward off what they most dreaded, a united capitalist attack on Soviet Russia. And really, it was difficult to see what other course Soviet Russia could have followed. Ideally, they wanted the grand alliance with the West against the Nazis. But barring that, they turned the tables and made a pact with Hitler. When Hitler attacked Poland, the Soviets moved into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic territories that had been taken from them by Germany, Britain, and Poland in 1919. They overthrew the right-wing dictatorships that were in those countries. By the way, today we ought to remember when we hear about Lithuania going back to its democracy, that Lithuania wasn't a democracy. They were right-wing dictatorships that the Western counter-revolutionaries had installed in the Baltic states. The three states were incorporated as three republics into the USSR. The Soviets also took back western Belarus, the western Ukraine, and other areas seized from them and incorporated into the Polish right-wing dictatorship in 1921 under the Treaty of Riga. This has been portrayed as proof that they colluded with the Nazis to gobble up Poland, but the Soviets reoccupied only the area that had been taken from them 20 years before. History offers few, if any, examples of a nation refusing the opportunity to regain territory that had been seized from it. In any case, by reclaiming their old boundaries, the Soviets did draw a line on the Nazi advance. Even after Hitler attacked Poland and Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, the Western collaboration did not end. And this is a part of the history that's not known, never mentioned by George Will, never mentioned by commentators today, and not mentioned by many historians either. When Hitler struck east into Poland, nothing happened on the Western Front. Now, don't forget, Great Britain and France had just declared war. There were still feelers from London and Paris about making a separate peace with Hitler so that he could concentrate on Soviet Russia. From September 1939, when World War II began, to May of 1940, about 8 months, there was no fighting between Germany and the Western Allies, even though they were at war with each other. The French began to call it la guerre drôle, the funny war, or the droll war, or the lazy war, whatever you want to call it. Others called it the Sitzkrieg, instead of the Blitzkrieg, it was a Sitzkrieg, a sit-down war. In England and France, it was called the phony war. There was very little fighting. Now, Hitler had every intention of taking on the USSR. That was going to be his final big fight. He wanted the breadbasket of the Ukraine. He wanted the oil fields of Baku. He wanted to destroy the communists. But he had to widen his base before attacking the Soviet Union. And so he took Denmark and Norway. He invaded them in April of 1940. That gave him more resources, more food, more farmlands, more factories, more conscript labor. Even then, high-placed conspirators in the German General Staff made overtures to Great Britain for coordination of efforts. General Oster, Colonel Sass, General Beck, and even Field Marshal Rommel later on, they warned the British of Hitler's forthcoming, quote, violent, brutal offensive in the West. The British didn't take it serious. The British understood that there was an understanding with the Germans, and they were giving them all this European real estate, and they were finally going to move east and knock off the communist menace. If the British would only guarantee the plotters, the Germans said, a fair peace, they would go at Hitler and overthrow his Nazi regime. The new government would relinquish Czechoslovakia and Poland and everything else except Austria. That was their first offer. London did not even take the offer seriously. In May of 1940, Hitler struck west. He wiped out France and much of the British army at Dunkirk. Then he attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin had expected it sooner or later. In 1939, Stalin had said, "We have 10 years. In 10 years we have to do what Britain did in 100 years. And there came the forced industrialization, as Soviet Russia built a whole new industrial base east of the Urals, an industrial base which eventually outproduced Hitler in tanks, planes, and artillery. 80% of the German casualties were on the Eastern Front. The scale and ferocity of the fighting was unparalleled in the West, or in any modern warfare ever. There was nothing in the Western Front that could compare to the Battle of Stalingrad, involving millions of troops, the Battle of Leningrad, where 2.5 million Soviets died, the Battle of Kursk, involving tens of thousands of tanks, the Battle of Warsaw, which took 2 months, the Battle of Berlin, where 3 million Soviet troops were arrayed against 1.5 million German troops, with almost 1 million casualties by both sides. Most discussions in the West about World War II focus on the Western War, which is about 1/5 of the actual war, and ignore the scale and horror and heroism of the Eastern Front. Most discussions in the West about the eve of World War II give us the usual blather about the Hitler-Stalin Pact and say little about the active collaboration of the right-wing Tory government, about the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact. Just as little today is said about the active collaboration of a right-wing U.S. government with fascists throughout the Third World and with Nazis in the Republican Party and in Bush's own campaign. The fascists are okay because they defend private property and corporate investments. It's the communists that are the menace, according to those who own the world. Those of us who want democracy might want to think about this a little more seriously. This is Michael Parenti for Some Real History.
That was Michael Parenti with the last part of a 4-part series on history, the real causes of World War II.